let's look at Jane Eyre from the point of view of three of its main themes: the theme of gender, the theme of empire, and the theme of madness. We can find those themes all through the novel, so let's get stuck into the idea that we're going to look at them right from the beginning, right from these very early chapters. Here we go. Here is Jane. She's hidden away behind the curtain, peacefully reading her book. And right here we can see the way in which imperialist discourse and imperialist themes are tied together with themes of gender. So empire and gender, sex, the question of male and female, these things are tied together, and this is something that we're going to find all the way through the book. She's sitting cross-legged like a Turk. Those are the words that she chooses to describe herself, like a Turk. That's actually quite significant, and we're going to find references to Turks and to harems, where in the Middle East men have many wives and things like that. We're going to find those kinds of images of a sultan, a Turkish or Middle Eastern prince, and so on. Those images are going to come up again later on. So let's take a look at this idea that she's sitting cross-legged like a Turk, and then John comes and tries to bring her under his control, and she rejects him, saying, "You're like a slave driver, you're like the Roman emperors." So she's the Turk, all right? She's the Turk being attacked by the Roman emperors. In the same way, he is invading her privacy as a little girl. So we've got the gender issue of a big bully, a big male bully coming along and bullying a little girl, and we've got the imperial issue of the Roman emperors, slave drivers coming and attacking Turkey, which in fact they did historically. They did attack Turkey, so there's quite a real comparison going on here. And Jane, she's the passionate little girl, fighting them off like a little Turk, and he's the John Reed is the cruel slave driving Roman. All right. This kind of dialogue is going to come back again. We're going to see it later on in the story. So we need to get a grip on it at this stage. This image of a sort of Middle Eastern power structure in which women, of course, are held to be inferior, but at the same time, there's this whole British Empire and the idea that Britain is controlling the rest of, or much of the rest of the planet at this stage. So that's also part of what's reflected in the novel. So here we've got Jane in the Red Room, all right, being attacked by John. Let's look at it from another point of view now. She says, I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. This is the language that she uses to describe the situation. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. I felt a drop or two of blood from my head trickle down my neck and was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations for the time predominated over fear, and I received him in frantic sort. She is frantic. Frantic, of course, suggesting that she's out of control, she's not her normal self. And the housekeeper and maid are perfectly scandalized by Jane's behaviour. Dear, dear, we get. What a fury to fly at Master John. She gets the blame. Never mind that she's being bullied, the fact that she's the victim. And she's criticised for her passion. We'll come back to passion. Passion is really important here. She is a picture of passion. Women were not supposed to show their feelings, their emotions, their passions in that kind of way, and therefore she's criticised, doubly criticised, because she's a fury, she's frantic, she's wild, and she's expressing her passion, her feelings in a way that's not acceptable in that society at that time. And then Jane's aunt, who is also on the scene, says, take her away to the Red Room and lock her in there. So she's going to get punished for her behaviour. And it's a pretty drastic punishment. It has a huge effect on Jane. So they take her away to the Red Room, and she's to be locked in there, and that's to be her punishment. This is the room where her uncle died, and as a sensitive little girl, she panics. She thinks she sees her uncle's ghost, and she has a species of fit, is the expression in the book. She has a species of fit, a kind of attack of some kind of strange attack, and she falls unconscious, waking up to find herself in the bed and being under the care of the kindly Mr. Lloyd. He's an apothecary, he's not a doctor. If it had been Mrs. Reed's own children, she would have called a doctor, but she calls an apothecary, who is a sort of slightly lower status. But he's a kind man, and he looks on her kindly. Now, all through her life, this incident of the Red Room has a big effect on Jane. Later on in the novel, she says, it didn't actually drive me mad. It only gave my nerves, well, something to that effect, and then it only gave my nerves a shock of which I feel the reverberation to this day. So she still feels the effect of it. She's a sensitive person, and later on in life, she still feels the effect of what was done to her there. Well, she's lucky. To be honest, in the context of Victorian society, she's lucky. She suffers fearful pangs of mental suffering. And that's, well, nobody wants to suffer those. So it's not a good thing in itself, but it's nothing compared with what could have happened if Mr. Lloyd had been a less kind person. If it hadn't been Mr. Lloyd who came to look after her, it might have been someone with a lot less understanding, a lot less sympathy. Somebody who felt that her symptoms were a sign of madness. Someone who would send her to some kind of mental institution. Now that could happen a lot more easily than you might think. The girl was hysterical. She was imagining things. Her behaviour was extreme. She'd worked herself so much into an emotional state that she had a fit and she lost consciousness. And for doctors, for some doctors, especially male doctors, those could be considered signs of madness even today. And the fearful pangs of mental suffering that Jane experiences could be seen as a form of mental illness. And remember, in those days, all doctors were male. So a man's judgment, and again, it's a gender issue, isn't it? It's a man's judgment that perhaps Jane is crazy at this point. She's lucky. Mr. Lloyd doesn't think like that. He's a gentler, kinder kind of person, and he doesn't think that she's mad. In fact, he listens to her quite carefully and feels that she's got problems in the Reed family, and that they are, to a certain extent, or perhaps quite greatly, to blame. as this picture shows, even as late as 1887, quite a long time after Jane Eyre was written and published, you've got male doctors displaying women's hysteria as insanity. She's a hysterical woman at a medical conference in France. It could just as easily have been England or any other country in Europe at this time. The basic paradigm was that all the doctors were men, and who decided that a person was crazy? Well, the doctors did, the male doctors. And the simple reality is that there were more than twice as many women locked up as being crazy than there were men. There's quite a well-known book by Elaine Showalter called The Female Malady, actually, which writes about how madness became a sort of women's thing during the 19th century, the feminization of madness. Before that, you'd had disturbing images of wild, dark, naked men, and that had been the image of insanity. But by the 19th century, it's more like the poetic, artistic, theatrical image of a youthful, beautiful woman. And that is how insanity is perceived very largely during the 19th century. And so you've got a change during the Enlightenment, during the 18th century Enlightenment, the sort of age of reason. You've got a shift to a different paradigm, a different position, a different view of madness. And in that view, women are typically on the side of irrationality, silence, nature, body. That's what women represent. Men are reason, discourse, culture, mind. Men are on the side of logic, women are on the side of illogic, a sort of emotional world of nature and body and silence, in contrast with male culture, which was the reasonable culture, the culture of logical discourse, the culture of the mind. And so what we're seeing in Jane Eyre, in these early chapters of Jane Eyre already, is gender and insanity being linked together in a certain way. And as I've already said, we've got gender and empire. So we've got these three themes, and there will be others, but we've got these three themes to focus on right from the beginning.